On North America's East Coast, wildlife adapt to the rise and fall of the tides. Tides provide a much-needed resting place for mammals and unveil a feast for thousands. On the jagged coast of Canada's eastern shore, a delicate and diverse ecosystem thrives on the fringes of the continent. Welcome to the Wild, Wild East. The tide is an awesome force of nature. 160 million metric tons of water of the Bay of Fundy twice each day. The waters carve and shape the shore, transforming the landscape. The creatures here evolved and adapted to exploit this ever-changing habitat. Great blue herons living inland get up to 40% of their diet from rodents. But here, it's 98% fish, easily snatched from the shallow, muddy puddles of low tide. Crows and ravens also scavenge along the rocks for stranded crabs and crustaceans. Low tide is a picnic, laid out twice daily for those living along the shore. But in just hours, it will all be gone. The tides in the Wild, Wild East are the highest anywhere in the world, rising as high as a 5-story building. Bluffs will become islands. Mudflats will become the ocean floor. Duncan's Cove, Nova Scotia is a rocky headland eroded out of granite barrens by eons of pounding surf. Even in the middle of summer, the ocean here remains chilly. This pod of gray seals doesn't seem to mind at all. Their protective layer of blubber keeps them warm, allowing them to stay in cold environments all year round, even in winter. Now the tide is high, and they're coming up for a breath of fresh air. Gray seals spend most of their lives in water, and they're most often spotted just like this. It's a behavior called bottling, bobbing in the water with just their heads sticking out to breathe and look around. Below the surface, the gray seal moves with an agility that seems improbable for a creature that weighs twice as much as a linebacker. Their webbed hind flippers propel them forward, and they use their front flippers to steer. Their flexible spine lets them twist and turn through the water and hunt down fish on the fly. The gray seal shares the oceans of the Wild, Wild East with its very similar-looking but smaller cousin, the harbor seal. The easiest way to distinguish between the two species is to look at their heads from the side. Gray seals have a straight profile, like a horse's head. Its unflattering scientific name translates to hook-nosed sea pig. The harbor seal has a clearly defined muzzle, which is why its scientific name means sea dog. The harbor seal gets its common name because it's the seal most often seen close to land. Both gray seals and harbor seals feed, breed, and thrive in the cold waters of the Wild, Wild East. All seals are semi-aquatic, alternating between life on land and underwater. When the tide is high, haul-out spots on land are harder to find. It's easiest to stay wet, and seals have specially evolved to spend most of their time in the ocean. Like all mammals, seals need to hold their breath underwater. When they dive, their heart rate slows down from 120 beats per minute to as few as 4. That reflex allows them to use less oxygen and stay underwater longer, up to a half an hour. Their nostrils close to seal up their airway underwater. Their big eyes give them excellent underwater vision for spotting cod and other undersea delicacies. Seals have been known to travel great distances in search of food or a mate. Harbor seals are found in the Atlantic and the Pacific and as far south as Mexico. But gray seals stick to the waters of the North Atlantic. And Nova Scotia is home to the world's largest colony of gray seals. More than 100,000 congregate each winter to mate on Sable Island, 175 kilometers from the mainland. But even when they're not breeding, seals usually don't stray too far from places to haul out. High tide is high time for swimming. But low tide will offer a chance to relax. Later today, these rocks will be more exposed and will give the seals some place to rest. On another shore of the Wild Wild East, a seasonal visitor is about to transform the landscape. The tide is going out at Johnson's Mills, New Brunswick, a small town on the edge of the Bay of Fundy. The sleepy mudflats of this shoreline are about to be flooded with life. It's beginning now, off in the distance. These are semi-palmated sandpipers, about 100,000 in all. They're incredible migrators, flying 16,000 kilometers a year. They've come more than 3,000 kilometers to get here, flying up to 3 days at a time without rest. They spent the winter and early summer in the Arctic, breeding, nesting, and caring for their young. And now they're on their way to South America, another 4,000 or so kilometers. Flying that far requires a lot of fuel and the occasional pit stop. And that's why they're here, for a few weeks of rest before moving on. The Bay of Fundy is a stopping point for almost every semi-palmated sandpiper in the world. Conservationists consider them near threatened, so places like this, called staging points, are critical to the survival of the species. The mudflats of Johnson's Mills offer plenty of food and elbow room, the perfect place for sandpipers to rest, regroup, and refuel. The tide is out completely now. As the water pulls away, it reveals a seafood buffet for the little semi-palmated sandpipers. They hunt and peck, spearing the mud for the crustaceans, worms, and other creatures left behind by the changing tide. Few places in the world expose such massive mudflats at low tide. 1 square meter of mudflat contains as many as 100,000 mud shrimp. That's a good thing when there's 100,000 mouths to feed. There's plenty for everyone. Biologists think the sandpipers pick this place for a pit stop because of the abundance of food, and because the wide open mudflats allow them to see any predators on the horizon. The sandpipers feel around for movement in the mud. They search by touch for tiny shrimp and other creatures by jabbing around with their squat black beaks. They gorge here and double their weight in just 2 weeks. They're not the only ones taking advantage of this free lunch. This black-bellied plover is looking for sandworms and small crabs. He's also refueling for a long migration and is taking advantage of such a large tidal zone. Plovers are an entirely different family of wading birds, and they have a different hunting technique. They sprint through the shallows until they spot something tasty, then snatch it up, as opposed to the steady probing technique of the sandpiper. Soon, they'll all be moving on. For the harbor seals of Duncan's Cove, low tide offers the chance for some well-deserved rest. Hauling out onto the rocks is an important way for seals to conserve energy. Constant swimming burns a lot of calories. In a single day, an adult harbor seal must eat as much fish as 64 cans of tuna. Relaxing on this remote outcropping also keeps seals safe from ocean predators, like sharks, and isolated from terrestrial predators like bears and coyotes. During molting season, they scratch and scrape on the rocks to shed old skin. Seal bodies just aren't adapted well for life on land. Their limbs are shorter than any land mammal, and what looks like their armpit is actually their wrist. So graceful in the water, they're reduced to humping around on land, flopping themselves forward on their bellies. That's even more work than swimming. It's much easier to just stay put. Even though harbor seals are mostly solitary, they become temporarily gregarious at haul-out sites. A good spot is hard to find, so everybody tries to get along. Big males sometimes scrap during mating season, but this is a time for chilling out. So long as they maintain some personal space, dust-ups outside mating season are pretty rare. Off to the side, a gray seal uses the same haul-out spot, but keeps a healthy distance. Gray seals are a lot bigger and have been known to eat harbor seals, but there's no chance of a surprise attack here. They're equally inept at moving around on land. Seals' closest relatives aren't marine mammals like whales or dolphins. They're actually more closely related to bears and dogs. You can sort of see it if you imagine their blubbery bodies enveloped everything except their hands and feet. There's a clear pecking order here on the rock, with the youngest seals on the outside, closest to the water. They're not big enough to compete with the big males for the prime spots further up. And sometimes mother seals leave their pups close to the water, so they can go find fish and check on Junior without hauling out again. These aren't this year's pups, but they're still young. They're probably 2 or 3 years old. By the time they're 6 or 7 years old, they'll be full grown like these guys. The oldest males could be as much as 35 years old. They'll all loaf around until the tide rises again. The sandpipers at Johnson's Mills, New Brunswick, need their rest too. They've come a long way and have a long journey ahead. Some birds sleep on one foot to keep one leg warm at all times. Or they can tuck both in to get cozy. They do this because the sandpiper's bare legs are the place they lose heat fastest. Birds need to maintain a high body temperature to burn calories fast enough for the tremendous effort required to fly. Resting their head on their back and nuzzling it into the feathers is another way to conserve heat. And if a bird gets too warm, it shakes out its feathers to release the heat trapped near its body. A single bird has thousands of feathers. Preening is a sort of preventative maintenance on the sandpiper's flight gear. A gland near the tail produces an oil that the bird smears on its beak, then spreads over all its feathers. It helps with waterproofing and removes dust and dirt. The sandpipers peck away parasites while smoothing and shaping each feather's position in anticipation of the journey ahead. The particular size and shape of the Bay of Fundy amplifies the effects of the moon on the Atlantic's tides. In flat areas, the difference between high tide and low tide is the distance of 10 football fields. When the tide is in, the mud flats vanish. The rising waters push the semi-palmated sandpipers into a tighter formation. The security advantages of crowding like this seem obvious. More eyes and ears, keeping a watch for predators. When trouble starts, the whole flock reacts as one. Scientists have long studied the other functions of flocks. It's tough to see where one bird ends and another begins. Maybe this confuses and confounds predators. The security of the crowd will soon prove critical. Because high above, somebody is watching. To some predators, the flock of sandpipers represents opportunity. Peregrine falcons are high-speed, airborne predators. A diving peregrine plummets faster than any other creature on the planet. "200,000 wings begin beating. The flock moves with a coordination some have compared to telepathy. The flock is on the move. Scientists puzzle over how they all know to move at once. Now, watch this. The peregrine flies directly into the swarm. Look again, the falcons a blur, blasting straight into the mass of confusion, the flashing of feathers. The peregrine only needs one bird. But today, he can't hold on to his lunch. Even if the falcon had been successful, one bird out of 100,000 is a pretty successful defense from an evolutionary standpoint. But the flock is sufficiently spooked. These shores are a dangerous place. They're moving on, heading south, following an ancient migratory path, orienting themselves by the sun, the stars, and the Earth's magnetic field. They won't rest again for days. Back in Duncan's Cove, the rising tide is slowly evicting the seals from the granite outcroppings along the shore. The waves lap the ledges where the seals haul out. Soon, this island will disappear until the tide goes out again. Before long, it's even more than a seal can handle. It's goodbye to the landlubber's life for now. After 6 hours of maximum rest and relaxation, it's time to go. They spend most of their lives in the water, where their big bodies swan around with the grace of a ballerina. They're built for the swim, but adapted for the rise and fall of the tides. In the early half of the last century, people hunted gray seals to near extinction on the American shores just south of here. But after decades of conservation, gray seals from Canada's wild east have been discovered repopulating the coastal waters of New England. The tide may have finally turned in their favor. Poets wax philosophical about the turning tides symbolizing the never-ending passage of time. They are relentless, predictable, and reliable. But they also represent change. In nature, the receding tide reveals opportunity to rest and to feed. As it rises, the sea reclaims everything it exposed before. The creatures living here evolved to exploit the rhythms and cycles of nature. The rise and fall of the water and the ebb and flow of life in the wild East.